So our Curious Minds series in the past has been obviously held on campus, and you can see our beautiful campus there. And of course, it's nice to have people here in the room today and on campus on this beautiful day. We will, of course, continue some of these combined virtual and in-campus events in the future, and we hope you decide to attend. Our series essentially is premised on one single idea, that talking about books and ideas, and really as many different ideas as we can, is as important educationally as are the books and the subjects themselves. And today, we're very, very pleased to have on campus virtually Johan Norberg, who is speaking to us from Sweden to speak on his book, Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future. And you can see that's one of my favorite quotes from the book itself, which comes relatively early, that I have there on your screen. If we're looking for a monument to science and wealth and technology, then look around us. So for today, the way this is going to work for those of you who are new, now that I've introduced the series, Johan will speak for maybe half an hour, maybe a little bit more on his book and why we should look forward to the future. And while he is speaking, be thinking about questions you would like to ask. You can type them in the lower right-hand corner of your screen in the chat box, or those of you who are here in the classroom can simply ask me and I'll repeat them to our online audience. Okay? And obviously, after the talk is over, we'll ask Mr. Norberg those questions. A couple of questions that I typed up that we kind of already addressed with him a little bit. Which one of these, and this is for the audience here, which one of these do you think he thinks might be true? That the arc of history bends towards progress, or history suddenly feels circular? Or maybe it's both at the same time. Give that some thought. Okay. And how might recent events, I think about the Ukrainian war, for example, how might that fit in with his thinking about progress and looking to the future positively? Okay. Why do we often get up each morning believing the world is falling apart? What kind of politicians in this country and in other countries take advantage of this perception or this feeling? That's something to think about as well. And then many of you here and online, many of you students are somewhere between 18 and 25 years old. Of course, I'm only about 27 or 28 myself, but at any rate. So why should you feel optimistic about the future? Because I think Mr. Norberg will give you some good reasons why you should feel optimistic and why you can explain that. So Johan Norberg is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. His writings focus on globalization, entrepreneurship, and individual liberty. He's the author or editor of several books, including the one we're focusing on today, Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future. He more recently came out with a book, and I'll hold it up right here, called Open, The Story of Human Progress, which is, I think, more of an even broader history of humanity in a sense, and that too I would recommend to the audience. So really, without any further ado, Johan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all of you who are present, wherever you are geographically. Thanks for the invitation to talk on this subject about progress. I happen to think that it's more important than ever to talk about this topic because it is quite contrarian. There was an NBC poll in January that pointed to, it was quite revealing. An overwhelming majority believed that America is headed in the wrong direction. And when asked to describe where they believe America is today, the top answers were downhill, divisive, negative, struggling, lost, and last but not least, bad. So there is a lot of pessimism out there, and I think we can all share that when we pay attention to some of the news that crosses our attention. And therefore, I think it's important to talk about progress. And that's what I'm going to do. I'll briefly summarize my case for progress and discuss the causes of progress. And I'll also try to explain why I wrote about it. Because I think that's perhaps even more important than the content. And I know that some of you have read the book, so that's at least some sort of added value to the whole thing. So to start off, why do I believe in progress? Well, let me just share two different stories that I read in the same magazine, two stories about health. One story was about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the great composer. And the other story was about a guy named George. And both were about their health situation. And Mozart, of course, died very young, a bit more than 200 years ago. And now researchers had discovered why. It wasn't a fancy conspiracy or poison or anything like that. Apparently, he died from a sore throat. He had some bacteria in his throat, and he might have gone to the doctor, and they said, yeah, you have a sore throat, so you might die. Because that's how you died 200 years ago, even if you were the greatest composer on the planet, even if you were the king or the emperor, because medical science was at a fairly primitive stage. There were no antibiotics, no possibility to deal with any microorganism in any way. The other story was about George, 10-year-old. He had something worse than a sore throat. He had a brain tumor. So cancer in his brain, but nowadays doctors can do something about that. So he underwent surgery, and it was a difficult process. And at one point his heart stopped beating, but they managed to revive him, the team, and got him back to health. And as I read the story, George was back to his old happy self. And that's pretty amazing in itself, of course, that medical science is able to do those things. But it gets even more interesting when you realize that George is not a human being. George is a goldfish, a tiny goldfish in an aquarium, which means that our goldfish today, our pets today, have access to better medical care than the composers and emperors and kings and queens had 200 years ago. And I say this to just briefly explain, if you stumbled over a time machine and had the ability to go back in time to any other time period, don't go there. At least if you're not able to get back. Because even if you had the best position in that society, not being a serf or a slave or a peasant under a feudal aristocracy, well, even if you were a king or an emperor, your life would probably be much more miserable than it is in this day and age, because something dramatic happened in the last 200 years. Life expectancy across the planet increased from around 30 years to more than 70 years. Extreme poverty declined from about 80 to 90% to around 8 to 9% today. Back then, in Mozart's day and age, 90% of the world population could not read and write. Now it's the reverse. 90% are able to read and write, which of course is a capacity to acquire more capacity, including learning about the human body and the body of goldfish, and build your own creativity on top of the accumulated knowledge of everybody else. So something dramatic happened 200 years ago that changed the world and our opportunities forever. But we don't have to go that far back in time to find progress. Only in the last 30 years, we can see that this process has sped up. Poverty, illiteracy, child mortality, and chronic undernourishment halved, or more than halved, in the last 30 years. The number of extremely poor on the planet declined over these 30 years by around 150,000 people every day, which means that poverty in Latin America, in Eastern Asia, in Middle Eastern, Northern Africa, poverty there is now less than it was in the Western world in the 1960s. And that tells you something about how far we've come. And that's because scientific knowledge, technological innovation, and economic opportunities have grown quite dramatically, and they've spread throughout the world at a rapid pace. So we're able to do more things. We're able to solve more problems. We're able to learn more about the human condition and how to improve it. That's the basic case for human progress and why I'm convinced. And that doesn't mean, of course, that everything will be all right. Optimism doesn't mean that we won't face problems or even disasters in the future. It just means that we should be hopeful about our ability to deal with problems and disasters in a better way. The more knowledge, the more innovation, the more wealth that we acquire. And I think that this pandemic, awful as it's been, has proven that case. Because when you ask yourself, when is the best year ever to face a pandemic? We would prefer never to face a pandemic, of course, but that's not the case. They do occur on a fairly regular basis throughout human history. And when would be the best year to face one? Well, again, think about that time machine and go wherever you want to face a new coronavirus or any kind of pandemic like that. And then fairly soon you realize that in most historical episodes, a virus like that, any kind of microorganism, would just keep on recurring until all vulnerable had been killed. In Europe, the Black Death, the terrible plague of the 14th century, killed at least a third, perhaps more than half of Europe's population. And it kept recurring for 400 years because there was no cure, no vaccine, no ability to deal with it. So it kept coming back and killing off more people all the time. Now, for the first time, we can fight back. Never before have scientists, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies had so much knowledge and technology at their disposal, and never before have they cooperated in this manner across the world in real time, online. And the result has been, at least relatively speaking, considering all the deaths and disasters, relatively speaking, the result has been a triumph. It took mankind 3,000 years to develop a vaccine against polio and smallpox. This time around, it didn't take more than 3 months to have several different vaccines in clinical trials. And people had shots in their arms within a year of us even hearing about the new coronavirus for the first time. And that tells you something about capabilities that would have seemed like magic to our predecessors. And think about it, even if we were to take the time machine back in time of just a few years or a few decades, we would end up in a very different world with less capabilities. Had we faced this new coronavirus in 2005, we wouldn't have the mRNA technology with which we can create vaccines and redesign them faster than ever. Had we faced this coronavirus in 1975, we would not have had the ability to read the genome of the virus to understand what it was all about. Had we faced this coronavirus in the 1950s, we would not have had a single ventilator on the planet to take care of people and help them to get oxygen when they were ill. And had we had this coronavirus before the internet and before the World Wide Web, our economy would have collapsed completely, as would our social relationships during lockdown. We wouldn't have had any distance learning, no work from home, no Netflix and home entertainment, no home food delivery, and hey, no lectures from the other side of the Atlantic to talk about human progress. So we don't live in the best of possible worlds, but I dare to say that we live in the best time, the best one so far, to survive a plague, to survive new unpredictable surprises that our mistakes or nature throws at us. And that, I think, is the most important case for optimism. It doesn't mean that things will just end up well, just automatically. It doesn't mean that we won't face horrible things in the future. It means that we have the capability, if lots of people are free to look for new solutions to those problems, we will be able to deal with things in a better way, almost on a year-by-year basis, improving our opportunities to do that. So why then do I write about it? Why do I devote so much time to talk about this kind of rational optimism, this hope in human progress? Well, the reason is that few know about it. When you ask Americans and Brits, around 6% of the population believe that the world on the whole is improving. Just 6%, which means that more people believe in ghosts than believe in human progress. More people believe that the moon landing was fake than believe in human progress. And of course, you're a very knowledgeable audience here, so perhaps you already believe in human progress, but at least our instincts don't. We have this tendency to wake up in the morning and to think that the world is falling to bits. At least I do. And that's one reason why I don't trust my instincts. I don't trust my feelings. I trust statistics, data, history, and economics, because that tells us, gives us more hard data and facts about where we are and where we've come from. There is a big human ignorance program, series of polls being done by the Swedish late professor of international health, Hans Rosling. And one of the questions that he posed to audiences and populations was asking them whether they think that global poverty had fallen by half, doubled, or remained the same in the past 20 years. Well, then only 5% of Americans answered correctly that it had fallen by half. In fact, it had much more than fallen by half. So even that was wrong. And that's interesting because it means that Americans are worse at understanding the world than chimpanzees. And not just Americans, the French too, and the Brits and the Swedes. So it's nothing personal. Because by guessing randomly, a chimpanzee would pick the right answer out of 3 choices far more often, of course, a third of the time, not just 5% of the time. If you wrote those different answers on different bananas, they would pick the right banana more often than Americans and Swedes. And that tells us something important. It tells us that this is not ignorance. It doesn't just mean that we're not very well informed about the world. Not if you can't beat a random choice. In that case, we must have inaccurate assumptions based on misleading or outdated information. And I think that's what we get every day. That's at least what I wake up to every morning when I check my cell phone and check to see what has happened since I last tuned in. And most often it's horror, death, famine, and plague. And horrible, horrible crime and war. And that's partly because that is going on around the world. But it's also a special focus on those horrible stories. It's when we try to learn about the world by just paying attention to the news and the most dramatic things that have happened since last we tuned in, then it's a little bit like if a Martian came to planet Earth and tried to understand what was going on by going to hospitals and the emergency rooms. The things that are happening there are really happening. So it wouldn't be a false view of what was happening on planet Earth, but it would be distorted because he would only see the really bad stuff. And that's because we know that bad news sells. 40 million planes might land safely every year, but the one plane that doesn't land safely, that's news. That's what we pay attention to. It's dramatic, and therefore it sells. And with social media, it gets even faster because then there's always a cell phone camera there when something goes wrong in the world. So the more important question is, why does it sell? Why do we pay attention to it? And to me, the answer is that bad is stronger than good, at least in terms of the space we devote to it in our attention span. It's in our nature for several reasons. Psychologists have seen this. It's we pay more attention to, we feel more passionately about, and we remember it more vividly when we lose money than when we make money, when we lose a friend than when we make a friend, when we lose a game than when we win a game. And that's probably because of our long prehistory in much more worse and more dangerous conditions out there on the savannah. Losing just once to a lion or a saber-toothed tiger meant the end of us. So you had to pay immediate attention to anything that could go wrong. You had to look nervously at the horizon, whether there is a new storm, a predator, or a raiding tribe out there, because if you miss just once, that could be the end of you. And it means that our ancestors, they were the worried kind, and that helped them to survive and procreate. And we should be grateful to them, but it also meant that they passed on their very worried genes and the stress hormones. We also pay more attention to whatever could go wrong than whatever could go right. And of course, problem solved are problems forgotten. If you managed to find food yesterday, you forget about that problem, you move on to the next problem, finding food today. We forget about Ebola that we thought would kill us yesterday, or the polio, or the smallpox, because we've solved that problem. Nature is an economist and helps us to focus on the problems that are really problematic to us. So we move on to the coronavirus and pay attention to that. And now as that fades, we'll probably forget it in a quite shortly, and then we'll pay attention to something else, which means that it's easy to look back on all previous generations and think that, I mean, it probably wasn't so bad because they survived it. And the problems that they had, we know how to solve them. But we never know about the problems at hand, the ones that we have right now. And that's why every generation thinks that they are in a particularly difficult moment in time with no real solutions to our problems. And in a way, that's good, because that helps us to focus on problems, and therefore we'll also solve more problems than we would have otherwise. But it's also dangerous if it leads us to underestimate human potential, if it leads us to underestimate our ability to succeed with problem solving and our projects, and think that everything is hopeless. In that case, we won't solve the problem. And if we have this kind of constant bias built into ourselves in human nature, and we can see it revealed when we pay attention to certain news and focus on that rather than other things, if we have this automatic bias, we need something else. We need a conscious effort to overcome the bias and inform us in a better way. We need other reminders. We need books and ideas that tell us about something more, a broader context than we would think about automatically. That's why we study, that's why we read. That's why we do research, to learn something more. And to me, one important part of that is to appreciate progress and what it takes. Because, and here's the key, it is not automatic. It doesn't happen by itself. Some people, when they learn that I've written a book about how everything just improves, think that, okay, then we don't have to worry about progress. Let's just go and do other stuff with our lives. Well, in that case, I wouldn't have written the book if I thought so. I thought it's not automatic. It depends on certain institutions and on certain behavior. And specifically, I think it depends on the three I's: exploration, experiments, and exchange. The freedom to explore strange new knowledge about the world, about the atoms, about space, about the human body, and about new technologies. The freedom to experiment with this, with new technologies, with new innovations, with new business models, to see whether it works or if it doesn't. And the freedom to exchange this, so that when we've learned something, when we've produced new technologies, goods and services, we're able to exchange this with others, buy, sell, and trade, so that it spreads throughout the economy, throughout the world, so that more people learn about it. And the thing to understand about exploration and experiments is that they are unpredictable. They're not based on something that just comes from your mind fully formed, or come from a committee or from the government. It is unpredictable. It is based on many different experiments, on lots of people looking at different places and at different things and different possible potential solutions, and comparing their efforts and learning from one another. It's based not on plans, but on trial and error, on experiments, and then feedback from others, and pushback and adaptation, so that you try to perfect what you do, whether it be a thesis or a new machine. And that takes a certain degree of openness, of open societies and free markets, which leave room for surprises, which leave room for surprises coming from anywhere in the network. Anyone, anywhere, who uses his or her local knowledge and individual capability to create something new and experiment with it and see whether it works or whether it doesn't. That's the only way that we create progress and accumulate knowledge and capabilities. And that's also why nothing much happened until 200 years ago. For thousands and thousands of years, the average living standard didn't improve much around the world, because we didn't have that openness. We have had golden ages, definitely, and I write about them in the latest book that John mentioned, Open, the Story of Human Progress. We have had golden ages in ancient Greece, in Roman Empire, the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate, the Song dynasty in China 1,000 years ago, the early Renaissance, and so on. Periods where we had rapid scientific discovery, more innovation, and growth of economies. But those periods were short, and they were ended quickly. They didn't last because it is not automatic. They failed, and especially because most of them reverted away from this kind of openness and for surprises in times of crisis, during pandemics, wars, Great Depressions. They turned inwards and didn't want to experiment more, didn't accept different points of views, but reverted to one form of orthodoxy or another. And that ended and stifled progress in those eras. Until this one that started 200 years ago, when, beginning in Western Europe, some 200 years ago, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and then liberal democracy created a larger space for surprises, exploration, exchange, and experiments than ever before, and created a system of rule of law to protect this. This is why we should be happy to be alive today, because only this openness created that progress, which resulted in our living standards being the best ones they've ever been on the in the human experience. And I just think that it's important to write about it, to explain it, explain why it's not automatic, don't take it for granted, treasure it for your own good and for the world, because rational optimism is not about thinking that things will just automatically turn out fine, but it means that it's not hopeless. It means that if you work hard, if you look around hard enough, it might just work out. And that spirit of possibility is our best hope to solve the problem that still haunts us and will surprise us in the future as well. So therefore, in closing, before I open up for discussion, I think it's only fitting to quote the legendary author and disability rights advocate Helen Keller, who said that the reason why we should be optimists is that no pessimist ever discovered the secret of the stars, or sailed to an uncharted land, or opened a new doorway for the human spirit. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So we've got several questions here from the audience, and but I'm gonna take the first one and just ask if you think about. I'll bring up the one that we had earlier that I brought up at the beginning in the introduction. Does something like the war in Ukraine and the rise of what some people, I think Gideon Rockman of the Financial Times calls authoritarian strongmen, is this something that worries you a lot, or are you pretty optimistic about being able to overcome that threat to the open society that you describe?
That's a very important question, because it does worry me quite a lot. And this is one of the things that I spend most time on right now, because it does worry me. But before I assume that this is the sort of end of progress and that this refutes my basic optimism, I remind myself of where we are in a historical context. Because the war in Ukraine, awful as it is the first time that we've had a major war of conquest in the world since Saddam Hussein tried to conquer Kuwait in 1990. So that's more than 30 years ago. And in a from a historical perspective, that's a unique long distance between wars of conquests. It used to be that peace was just a brief intermission while everybody rearmed to start a new war. The amazing thing is that that is not the case anymore, and that wars between major powers is still not just a rarity. We're still in the middle of the longest period of peace between major powers for 1,800 years. Only in the during the Pax Romana under the Roman Empire, for a while, did we have a longer stretch of peace between major powers. And that tells you that somehow we've made progress even there when it comes to human violence and war. And I think we can see that in our reactions as well, that we talk about how the disunity, how we're all split and it's all partisanship and we can't unite around anything. Well, the whole Western world has stood up against this Russian aggression and tried to push back in ways that we didn't expect ourselves that we would just 2 months ago, because we think that this is so atrocious. And that's one reason why we don't see more wars of this sort, and hopefully this will be an exception in the longer run. So that's what I say, what I tell myself to comfort myself in in this context. The same thing goes with strongmen. I'm worried about Xi Jinping. I'm worried about Vladimir Putin, not just what they do to their own populations, but also other populations, militarily, Ukraine, perhaps Taiwan. Also how they try to undermine our societies. They know that if they can make us less united, we will be less of a resistance to them. And that's all worrying things, not unique historically. The modern thing is that we have more democracies and liberal democracies with also much more wealth, much more technology at our disposal than the despots. So they're up against a stronger enemy than they've ever been, those strong men. And I think, and I'm sorry this is getting long, but since this is top of my mind right now, I have to say this as well. I think that those strong men also show how weak they are, that their societies are much more fragile than open societies with free markets. They think they're strong, and we sometimes think they're strong because they're able to mobilize everybody and force them to go in a certain direction. But that's also their weakness. That's why they won't have as many experiments. And you need experiments to come up with not just innovations, better technologies, and more wealth, but you also need it just to navigate and understand where you are. This has been a terrible, terrible war, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia as well. The Russian military has been humiliated in Ukraine, and its economy is collapsing right now. And one reason is Putin was just informed by his own yes men. He got stuck in his own propaganda bubble, because that's what you do when you're a despot. You don't accept people who come up with contrarian views and dissent, and therefore you also lose sight of where you are. And that is a terrible mistake to make. I think Xi Jinping is doing the same thing. He thought he would be dictator on lifetime, and he would run on 3 different issues: dealing with COVID better than other countries, dealing with the economy better than others, and making friends with other anti-Western powers like Putin's Russia. Well, now they are all 3 are liabilities, precisely because of this strongman complex, where you don't listen to dissenting voices and you don't have experiments in society. The COVID situation is terrible, with horrible and very unpopular lockdowns, and that contributes to a faltering economy that was already under tremendous pressure. And well, nobody wants to be friends with Putin right now. So I wouldn't be shocked if 1 or 2 of those strongmen will last a shorter time in office than Ukraine's Zelensky, precisely because they can't bring the kind of progress, stability, and harmony and wealth to their societies that open societies do.
Anybody have a question in here? Yep. Okay, just think, come up with one. This is from one of my students, and they asked this. We've been collectively learning about the space race this semester, and you kind of mentioned about going to the stars. Could you talk about space as a form of progress? Has that been something you've given some thought to? The student asks.
What a great question. You know, it's not my field of expertise, but being a Star Trek fan, I've always considered space the final frontier, and that we should be venturing out there because we can, but also because I think it's a tremendous learning process. I think, just like Elon Musk, that we'll reduce risks if we don't have all our eggs in one basket called planet Earth, if we become a multiplanetary species in the future. And I think the resources at our disposal out there might be tremendous in terms, obviously, of metals and minerals, but also energy and solar and what have you. So there are so many opportunities out there, and I think we're going there. It's interesting with the space race and the moon landing in this context, because that was, in a way, an exception to the way I think that most progress happens. This was really a White House administration saying we should go to the moon, and Kennedy just sort of made sure that there was tremendous funding for it, and they did it. Obviously, lots of businesses and entrepreneurs and scientists involved, but still, it was one top-down project rather than plenty of experiments and other stuff. Still, it worked. A little bit over budget. Some would say it's still worth it, perhaps. But in that context, I think the most important and interesting thing is to realize that, unfortunately, the moon race was the end of it. We just went there, put a flag on the moon, and went back home. We didn't explore all those opportunities, partly because it was this political goal. It was in the midst of the Cold War. It's only now when we get businesses and eccentric billionaires and the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos of the world who experiment and compete with one another and come up with business ventures in space. Everything from broadband to the whole world to just basically making it possible for anyone to catch a ride, space tourism, or to put a satellite up there. Only then have we seen a real space race where we've seen the cost of going up in space collapsing and many different routes being taken, which I think is essential to make this a longer lasting project. So I'm quite hopeful about what is happening right now in space.
Okay. Another student wanted to know if you were familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work in The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics. And you had mentioned this personal indwelling bias that we have. Is this correlated with or similar to Haidt's view of us having a hive mind that we're subject to, that sort of thing?
I'm very happy that your student brought that up because, yes, I'm familiar with Haidt. I've read his work, which I find very interesting. Not just the book that was mentioned, also the happiness hypothesis, which I found incredibly interesting. I think it's related, and don't just take it from me. I've talked to him about it and talked about this bias and how it fits into his worldview. And I think that we came to an agreement that there was something to be said for this bias being there. One of the areas of deeply felt emotional principles is the search for stability, continuity, safety, security that's present on sort of both the left and the right. It's more like a human trait than a particular partisan trait. And it's not strange. We don't like unpredictability for obvious reasons. I want to know where I'm supposed to go tomorrow, where I can find the things I need, where I'll have breakfast, and preferably to know what I'll have for breakfast. We don't like things being constantly in motion and being difficult, being unpredictable. And that is difficult. That creates a sort of status quo bias when we apply it to whole societies. Then whenever we find a problem, we want the solution. If there is deindustrialization or global warming or geopolitical competition, there is this tendency to just long for a big government or a strong man to just point us in a certain direction and tell you, we have the solution. We can fix this. We know what it is. We don't like the answer that if we have a couple of million experiments, people looking for solutions, there's probably a greater chance that we'll find the solution. So it is completely understandable why an open future might not be as tempting to everybody. There's something in us that rejects this. And that's another reason why it's not enough to trust our gut feeling and our instincts and our feelings. Because when we study history, when we study the history of innovation or of successful societies generally, all the things that we now treasure and want to keep were once completely unpredictable and only appeared as a result of those experiments and of that exploration. That's how progress happens. If we already knew all the knowledge that we and all the solutions to our problems, they wouldn't be in the future. They would already be here. It's only when we have this combination of different experiments and clashing and cooperating and exchanging that we can accumulate more and create something more. But when you read Haidt and some of the biases that we have, that's not always appreciated.
Right. This next question from a student is related to exactly what you were just talking about. So I kind of think I know the answer, but the student says, can you elaborate a little more on free speech as the key to an open society?
That's an incredibly important point, because yes, if we don't know everything, if we don't know the future and where to find the solutions to our problems, then we'd better listen to others as well, because we won't be able to think of all these things for ourselves. When I study history, when I study the golden ages and why they were so incredibly creative for at least brief periods of time, one common denominator is that they listened to dissenting voices. They were often at the crossroads between cultures, so they had missionaries and merchants and migrants crossing over, and then you had this wealth of different ideas and dissenting ideas, and out of that most will probably be bad, but only by having lots of it, you'll also find the golden nuggets that creates more progress. And only then will you find this clash between ideas and the combination of different ideas, which I think is the essence of creativity. You have something here, and then you see something there, and you combine it, and then newness comes into being. This whole temptation that we have to have safe spaces is understandable. It comes from this same search for safety, predictability, and purity in a way, but it's incredibly dangerous because that's the way to reduce the wealth that's in the universe. You lose perspectives on the world that you cannot compensate for. And that even goes for our opponents. It even goes for people you really dislike. I mean, I wrote a book about openness, trying to make the best case for openness in terms of open societies and markets and the benefits that migrants bring to the world. That book, yes, quite right. Now, I wouldn't be able to do that unless I listened to people who hate that kind of openness. Because I have a confirmation bias as well. Everybody does. It's not always conscious, but we always look for the information that kind of proves our points and builds our case. So we tend to ignore things that aren't really comfortable in our worldview. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous to us. We lose access to important information and will make a worse case than we otherwise would. Luckily, we have some great allies, our opponents. And it goes even, I've learned from some of the worst xenophobes and people who really hate, and authoritarians who really hate openness, because they've looked at other parts of the human psychology, they've looked at other parts of human history that I'm apparently, perhaps subconsciously, not comfortable with, and therefore I've forgotten all about. And I have to pay attention to them if I want to improve and learn more about the world. Doesn't mean I have to like them, but it means I mustn't cancel them.
Right, right. Okay, the next question is from a student in my spaceflight class, and he wants to know, could you elaborate a little more on the role that free markets play in progress? And the worrisome, he says, I'll read it aloud here. The United States, while rich, has wealth inequality. what can be done to correct this? So the question's a two-parter about free markets and progress, the relationship there, and then inequality and wealth.
That's a very good question. I think, well, the relationship is, well, it's empirical. You can look at countries when they started to liberalize markets and what happened then, and when they stop doing it, what happens then. And the case is really similar to the overall case for openness. The free market is a decentralized system. It means that you have you don't test innovations or business models by going to a committee or to the government or to the emperor and ask, is this a good idea and will you help us fund it? You test it, you trade test it, you experiment with it and put it out there and see what happens. You get feedback and you adapt to it, and we'll have plenty of experiments. We've had many different sources for funding, which means that even the crazy ideas, and again, most innovations were once upon a time seen as worthless, impossible, or stupid, or all three of them. So had we had majority decisions or committee decisions on what to fund, what to experiment with, we wouldn't have had any of the technologies that we now take for granted. So that decentralization spurs innovation and progress. And then with market transactions, we are able to specialize in the areas where we can produce more and exchange this with what we need from others, and thereby we also create more. So it creates lots of wealth, and that's, I think, undisputable, but it's not always equal rewards. Those who succeed in this game are tremendously rewarded, others not at all. And I'd say that in one way, it doesn't concern me much. In another way, it really does. And let me explain how. The first one is that when we focus on inequality, I think we pay too much attention to the dollars and cents in my pockets. The billionaires in the US, they have many more zeros after the numbers on their bank account than I do. But are they really that much better off? Let's go with another time machine experiment. And this one I borrowed from economist Donald Boudreaux, who said that if one of our ancestors 200 years ago were to appear in the home of Bill Gates or Elon Musk, what would surprise him the most? It would probably be, look, he's got water, safe water coming out of taps, and he can get rid of his waste just by flushing it down the toilet. He has a small device with which he can communicate with the whole world and get real-time information about what goes on in other places, and hear the greatest symphony orchestras playing instantly. And by the way, he's older than 30 years, higher than life expectancy was back then. He can go into a small metal tube and end up on the other side of the planet in just a couple of hours. Lots of amazing technologies. He's warm. He can just, or he can be cold on a warm summer's day just by pressing a button in the wall. Lots of different things would amaze our ancestors. And the interesting thing is that those things that would surprise them the most are the ones that we have in common with Elon Musk and Bill Gates, that even the middle classes in the Western world have access to. And that tells you something important about how access to the things that make life easier and more comfortable are probably more equally distributed than they have ever been before. Now, the difference with Elon Musk and Bill Gates is that they've got their own metal tube by which they can fly to the other side of the planet, whereas we have to share one with others, and we don't have as large a housing as they do. But that's not different from what it was like 200 years ago. The rich had that back then too. So in a way, this kind of free market capitalism, whereby you can only become fabulously wealthy by creating goods, services, technologies that people appreciate, should make us happy about people really prospering if they've done it on the market, if they've really done it by coming up with something better. But that is not always the case, and that's the second part of my worldview of inequality, because sometimes people don't compete by coming up with better solutions to our problems and our needs and our demand, but by having good contacts with politicians and with getting tax exemptions or regulatory favors or tariff protection or subsidies, and that's something that is incredibly unjust and unfair. And I think not just that, it also undermines the whole case for free market capitalism, because it makes it possible for a few big connected businesses to prosper on everybody else's expense. And if you're interested in that, I have a documentary on that called Corporate Welfare, Where is the Outrage, which gives many more embarrassing examples and some ideas for solutions as well.
Well, we're really pretty much out of time, and we'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And I would like to recommend to the audience Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future. The Economist magazine voted it one of its best books of 2016. And Mr. Norberg's more recent book, Open, The Story of Human Progress. I also recommend to the audience. I think one final thing I would ask, do you have a website or other sources that students could reference if they wanted to check into this a little bit more?
I do. Thank you for the opportunity for promotions here. johannorberg.net is my website, NET, but it's not very up to date. If you want the latest stuff and links to my videos and so on, it's really my Facebook page, Johan Norberg Official, where you can find most of the things I'm doing right now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And to the audience, thank you for listening in. This has been very enlightening, very interesting, and a good midweek talk. Thank you.
Thank you for all the great questions. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to follow us on our social media, like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.